KSB Board Development Online. I'm Brian Jordan, Director of Leadership Services.
And I'm Angie Stahlbaumer, Senior Attorney with KSB.
Today we're going to be talking about superintendent evaluation, and this is actually the first video of a two-part series. Today's topics will focus on why we evaluate the superintendent and the timeline or when we should be evaluating the superintendent. So with that, let's jump in.
Well, Brian, why don't you tell us, why is it that boards have to do superintendent evaluations?
What we remind boards is that they get to hire one employee and they get to evaluate one employee. Obviously, they oversee the processes of evaluation of the entire district, but they have one employee that they truly get to evaluate, and that's the superintendent. So we talk to boards, or we encourage boards to think about the superintendent, and their evaluation of the superintendent is one of the most powerful levers that they have to improve the quality of instruction within their system and within their schools. That's kind of the overarching purpose that we share with boards. But there's some other reasons why they formally evaluate the superintendent. One of them obviously is that the law says they have to evaluate the superintendent because the superintendent is a certified staff member, just like your teachers and your principals within the district. So there's that requirement by law, they have to evaluate the superintendent. Also, what we talk to boards about is the evaluation process is an assurance for the board that the work is happening that they see within the vision that they've established. So through that evaluation process, they're talking to the superintendent about the work that's happening, the direction that the district is heading, and giving feedback to that superintendent around the direction that they're leading the district in. Also, it helps with the communication between the superintendent and the Board of Education. If there's a good evaluation process in place, it forces the back and forth dialogue and that feedback for the superintendent to know that they're on point with where the board wants to go. But it also gives the superintendent, if done well, an opportunity to ask the board what direction they want to take with the overall district.
Very good. So when should boards be evaluating the superintendent?
Well, as I said earlier, by law, they have to evaluate the superintendent, and the law says they fall under the same, kind of criteria as your certified staff, which says once every 3 years. But in Kansas, the more traditional process is it's done on an annual basis, and there's some specific timelines that are spelled out in the law, and I'm going to let you talk a little bit about those because that's obviously more expertise for you.
Okay. Well, as Brian said, that's exactly right. The timeline for evaluating superintendents is the same as evaluating your certified teachers. So you have to evaluate them within the first 2 years. You have to evaluate them at least once by the 60th school day. So they may start their contract in July, but you have until the 60th school day to evaluate them in each semester. So, depending on when you start school, that can impact things. But once in the fall, once in the spring, and then after they've been in the district for 3 or 4 years, the requirement is once every year by February 15th.
Okay.
So after that, like you said, the law really would allow them to evaluate them once every 3 years by February 15th. But how do you feel about waiting 3 years?
What we tell boards about that is, really it is your opportunity to give some feedback to that superintendent. And if things are going great, it's probably not a big deal, but you're missing an opportunity to have some conversation around the direction of the district and the work that's happening in the district. And what we tell board members all the time is it provides cover and protection for you as well if you're doing that annual evaluation process, because you don't want to get into a situation where a superintendent has been going along doing very good in the district and then something happens and you haven't evaluated them for 2 years. If you happen to part ways with that superintendent, you may be opening yourself up to some potential liabilities if you haven't done a consistent evaluation process. Right. That's me putting on my lawyer hat, which I'm not a lawyer, but that's often what we tell boards is it needs to happen on an annual basis. And what we've tried to encourage boards to do is get out of the mindset of evaluation is just an event that happens in December or January, and more into a mindset of it's an ongoing conversation and a dialogue that happens over the course of the year. We have a slide that really represents, what are the steps that happen in an evaluation process if you're doing it in a manner that happens over the course of the year. So there's some key steps in that process if you're doing a year-round process that really help frame for the board what is the direction that the superintendent's going to lead us, but also there's some key steps in there that give the board an opportunity to provide that feedback about the direction. So we talk about the board really needs to do allow the superintendent to do a self-assessment on the instrument that they're using for the evaluation. What that does for the superintendent, it helps up front set the expectation of this is what you're going to be judging or evaluating me on, but it also frames for the board how the superintendent sees them carrying out their role. Because they do the self-assessment, they go into executive session, they talk about what the superintendent's marked on that self-assessment, and that's a point early on in the year where the board can give some good feedback to the superintendent and direct their work. And the next slide here that we're looking at, we encourage boards to consider doing that early in the year, fiscal year, like July or August. So that really sets the tone for the year. Gives a clear lens for the board to look at the superintendent's work through, and really sets the stage for what they should be looking for throughout the remainder of the year. Then there's some other key steps in that process or in that timeline, and we're going to dive into each one of those steps in that process in part 2 of our video series and talk a little bit more about what the actual work looks like for the Board of Education in each of those steps. But there's some key things that you need to think about. If it's February 15th when we have to have the superintendent's evaluation done, you need to backwards map when do we do each of those key steps. We've had a lot of questions this year specifically around, well, how do we handle the superintendent evaluation now that our board members are taking the seat in January? Because traditionally in Kansas, the superintendent evaluation would happen in January or February, and a lot of boards had some concerns about new board members coming in and not really having an understanding of the work that the superintendent is doing in the district. And so we've also put together a slide here that shows what a timeline could look like to have that evaluation completed early, like in December, prior to the new board members taking the seat in January. And you'd still obviously then do your contract negotiations and those things in the spring, but that would get that evaluation piece taken care of before new board members come in.
Well, and I was going to ask, when a board member will call me to talk about evaluation, it's more to understand the legal timeline. And so that's the matter of fact answer I give is, if they're new, by the 60th school day in this every semester. So in your process of evaluation, what are the key items that you think ought to be done to call it an evaluation by the 60th school day?
Good. So one of the things that we've encouraged boards to do, especially if they're working with one of those superintendents that's new to the district by that 60th day, is that self-assessment. If you've taken that self-assessment and you're meeting with the superintendent by the 60th day, you've given the superintendent feedback, you've discussed criteria of their evaluation, you can sign off on that as a Board of Education as their 60th day evaluation. A quick reminder there, the board gets to determine what the criteria of the evaluation is. And so you get to decide, does that constitute an evaluation for us? So that's one tip that we've given boards over the last few years to accommodate that 60th day requirement, because a lot of boards will tell us, I'm sure you hear the same thing, we don't even hardly know this individual and we have to evaluate them by the 60th day. Well, using that self-assessment and then meeting around that self-assessment is a great way to get to know your superintendent, along with set a tone and a direction for that new superintendent.
Well, and you mentioned that the board sets the criteria. So how do you feel about giving the superintendent input on the criteria?
Yeah, and so what we would tell boards is your criteria that you evaluate your superintendent on, and we'll dive into this in a lot more detail in the next part of the video series. Your criteria should be focused on those things that we know have an impact on student success. And so you've hired a superintendent to come in and hopefully lead your district. We would encourage the board to kind of get some of their insights into areas to address within their system to improve their system. And so by doing that self-assessment, you're giving that superintendent some opportunity for input into important criteria and key things to look at around their job performance.
Okay. So what do you think boards should focus on in the superintendent evaluation process?
So the key things that we will talk about coming up in the next video is you need to have some recognized standards that you're looking at. You also need to be looking at the actual functions of the job that the superintendent's performing. How do those get spelled out in our evaluation instrument? Another key thing to think about is our superintendent leading us in a way that's bringing some alignment to our system and some cohesiveness to our system, or is our system kind of just, you know, going its own way and kind of meandering, and each building is doing its own thing? Those are some key things that we're going to talk about in more detail in our second video in this superintendent evaluation series.
All right.
So we thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to visiting with you a little bit more in part 2 of the superintendent evaluation videos.